Hello everyone and welcome to this new video about level design. Today we're continuing our mini-series of 3 videos on how to make a good tutorial. And for this second episode we're going to discuss 2 important concepts, the tails and priming. Now just as a side note, if you're curious about the first episode on how skill gating can help you make better tutorials, feel free to have a look over here. But anyway, today we'll tackle a couple of key tutorial design principles. And first of all, let's focus on the concept of priming. So the main idea behind priming is something called the exposure effect, which is super common in lots of domains and, in a nutshell, is about training your brain to recognize specific patterns and react to them instinctively. This exposure effect is often used for advertisement or on radio stations that keep repeating the same song over and over again. The goal is to get you familiar with the track or the product and make it a nice, reassuring thing, to then, in this context, convince you to actually buy it. In a game, exposure is therefore an excellent technique to have players slowly interiorize mechanics or ideas without just explicitly laying out everything and cramming it in the gameplay. Rather, priming is often about subtle clues or visuals that keep popping around you and gradually tune your brain to better understand the game's world and its mechanics. Note that, shifting out of the context of a tutorial just for a second, priming is also used in video games to constantly recall your prime objective for a level. Typically, having some ever-present reminder of your destination point by making the whole shape of the level revolve around this central point, or having regular audio cues to update you on your progression, or a dialogue that tells you about the upcoming boss, or even a note somewhere that talks about the possible threats. Those are all examples of exposure where you're not directly told that you've finished X% of the mission, which could severely break the immersion, but instead you get little pieces of information that are cleverly embedded in the game's narrative and therefore maintain the illusion. Now, coming back to tutorial design, the important thing to keep in mind is that while some primers might be intuitive enough for you to just put them in your game and have the players automatically understand what's going on, there are also mechanics that you do need to explain. And that's the role of a tutorial. It's there to teach you the fundamentals of the game you're playing. So tutorial levels usually need to expose you to new situations, and if it's not obvious, indicate the right reaction so that later on, when confronted with the same thing, you know what to do. In other words, if the connection between the primer and the action is not intuitive, your tutorial has to establish and teach this connection. Of course, in that specific context, you might be able to lose some of the subtlety and instead ensure the mechanics are properly understood by explicitly naming and detailing the systems. Though it slightly decreases the willing suspension of disbelief, it's still better than the players having absolutely no idea how your game works. But another really cool thing with priming is that it can be used in conjunction with tails to foreshadow some parts of your gameplay to the player and create eagerness. Indeed, another crucial thing when designing a tutorial is that it has to introduce mechanics and gameplay systems that will be useful in the future. It has to give you skills to help you in the rest of your adventure that are really valuable and logical in this context. This brings us to the notion of tail, or in other words, an element that informs you on the game and its mechanics in a more or less explicit way. Cause although the first mechanics might be too simple to trigger any specific emotion with the players, the moment you start to show the particularities of your game, you raise both the bar for the gamers, in terms of difficulty, and their interest, cause they will start to think about all the consequences of this new technique. If you've played Fez, then surely you know that the first time you learn how to rotate the view, your whole horizon suddenly expands and you start to envision a lot of cool moments playing around with this mechanic. To me, that's actually the strength of a good gameplay idea. It has to be simple enough to be taught in a tutorial in a few seconds, but powerful enough to allow for emergent and yet natural outcomes. Of course, foreshadowing is not always completely obvious. It can also be about picking up some new special weapon or power and having a few rooms to train and learn how to use it before being faced with a boss that really poses a challenge and can only be vanquished thanks to this new weapon or power. Similarly, seeing a door that is locked, or a secret room that will only be accessible once you find a specific item or upgrade, is a nice foreshadowing technique, because it makes the players wonder and dream about this extra part of your world. It lights a little spark in their head that encourages them to level up, learn more about the game systems, or collect a specific item, and then come back later on to rediscover your game through a new perspective. Tales can thus be early warnings. They can be more or less implicit, and they can build up anticipation, which can lead to great aha moments where everything falls into place and you have all this gallery of nice techniques to mix and match to your liking, to solve a big problem or complete a really hard mission, and then you just feel like you've mastered the game. So to conclude, Tales and Priming are a great way to introduce all the not-so-obvious logic of your game to the players, in a somewhat subtle way, by exposing them to small chunks of systems and teaching them the appropriate reaction. Of course, you shouldn't overdo it, and as we said before in our video on skill gating, it's essential to decide on a scope for building your player's knowledge gradually. But all in all, foreshadowing all the possible consequences of a new game mechanic is a great way to keep the player's interest and really sell your gameplay. However, maintaining this level of interest also requires that you constantly feed your gamers with new challenges, and that you properly prioritize the discovery of your mechanics to give the players a real sense of progression and achievement. That's why next time we'll continue this discussion on how to make a good tutorial and talk about one last fundamental principle when designing tutorials, which is difficulty ramping. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this quick tips and techniques tutorial about level design, and that you've learned a few things about exposure, priming and tales. If you did, feel free to like the video and subscribe to the channel to not miss the next ones. And of course, don't hesitate to leave a comment with your own ideas for future level design tutorials. As always, thanks a lot for watching and take care.